Imagine for a moment that you've always believed in a single, perfect version of your favorite book. You've read it, studied it, and consider it the definitive text. Now, picture discovering that there are hundreds of different versions of that same book, each with its own unique twists and turns, illustrations, and even different words. This is the reality of medieval literature, and it challenges everything we think we know about what a work really is. When we talk about a famous medieval text like the Roman de la Rose, we often think of it as a single, cohesive piece of literature, but the truth is far more complex. Each manuscript of the Rose is a unique creation, shaped by the scribes who copied it, the artists who illustrated it, and the cultural context in which it was produced. These manuscripts are not just copies of an original. They are living, breathing entities that each tell their own version of the story. This multiplicity of versions raises a profound question. What is the real Roman de la Rose? Is it the sum of all these manuscripts, or is it something that exists beyond them? Some scholars argue that the true essence of the Rose is a hyper-concept that emerges from our collective experience with all its versions. Others contend that each manuscript is the work in its own right, a complete and valid representation of the text. The reality is that both views have their merits. The Rose, as a hyper-concept, is a powerful idea, one that helps us understand the enduring appeal and influence of the text. But each manuscript also has its own generative force, its own ability to captivate and inspire readers. This force doesn't come from the Rose itself, but from the broader culture of literary production in the Middle Ages. Scribes and readers were not just copying a text. They were participating in a vibrant, dynamic process of creation and interpretation. One of the most fascinating aspects of this process is the concept of mutable stability. Despite the many variations in the manuscripts, the Rose maintains a core identity that allows it to remain recognizable and meaningful over time. This tension between change and consistency is a defining feature of medieval literature. It shows that the form of a text is not static but dynamic, capable of adapting to new contexts without losing its essence. The way we read these manuscripts has also evolved. In the past, scholars relied on critical editions, carefully curated versions of the text that aim to present a single, authoritative version. These editions are invaluable tools, but they also strip away the rich, multifaceted nature of the original manuscripts. Today, digital repositories allow us to explore these manuscripts in their full complexity, to see the illustrations, the marginalia, and the unique features that make each one a work of art in its own right. Reading a digital manuscript is a different experience from reading a critical edition. It's more immersive, more interactive, and more challenging. It requires us to engage with the text in new ways, to consider the context in which it was produced, and to recognize the creative labor of the scribes and artists who brought it to life. This shift in reading practices is a reflection of the changing nature of our engagement with medieval literature. The rise of digital technology has opened up new possibilities for studying and understanding the Rose and other medieval texts. But it has also forced us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of literature itself. What does it mean to read a text when there are so many versions to choose from? How do we reconcile the idea of a single, definitive work with the reality of multiple, diverse representations? These questions are not just academic. They have real implications for how we think about literature, art, and culture. In the digital age, we have the tools to explore the full richness of medieval manuscripts, to see the Rose in all its complexity, and to appreciate the creative energy that shaped it over centuries. This is a new frontier in literary scholarship, one that challenges us to think beyond the boundaries of traditional critical editions and to embrace the dynamic, mutable nature of the texts we study. Variance, or the differences between versions of a text, is a key feature of medieval vernacular works like the Roman de la Rose. In the earliest versions, the illustrations and layout of the manuscript often reflect the social and cultural norms of the time when the work was written. However, as time passes, new versions of the manuscript adapt to the changing tastes and values of their readers. This means that a manuscript created in the 14th century, for example, might look and feel very different from the original 13th century work, even though it is the same story. One famous example of this is the controversy surrounding the Roman de la Rose in the early 15th century. Christine de Pizan, a prominent writer and intellectual, harshly criticized the poem, calling it immoral and misogynistic. This critique was particularly striking because the Rose was still being widely read and discussed, and many readers of the time saw it as a contemporary work, not as a relic of the past. The debate about the Rose was intense because the social and moral standards of the 14th century were quite different from those of the 13th century, and the newer versions of the Rose reflected these changes. But variance isn't just about the visual and cultural changes in the manuscript, it also affects the text itself. Historically, variance differences in the text between different manuscripts were often seen as errors or unimportant details. They were usually relegated to the margins of critical editions, where they were largely ignored. However, in 1989, Bernard Cerquiglini, a linguist, published a book called Eloge de la Variante, in praise of the variant, which changed the way scholars thought about these differences. Cerquiglini argued that variance was not just a series of random errors, but a fundamental aspect of medieval literature. He suggested that the joy of reading medieval works lay in the subtle variations and repetitions that made each version unique. Cerquiglini's ideas were revolutionary because they challenged the traditional approach of trying to reconstruct a single, original version of a text. Instead, he argued that the true nature of medieval writing was its variability and openness to interpretation. Variants, he believed, were not intermittent but constant, and they enriched the text by offering multiple perspectives and meanings. This shift in perspective has been particularly significant in the digital age, where scholars can easily compare hundreds of manuscript versions of the Rose and other medieval works. Digital technology has made it possible to see the dynamic life of these texts, how they evolved over time, and how they were shaped by different patrons, scribes, and readers. The digital library, therefore, is not just a collection of static images, but a living laboratory where we can study the processes of reading, writing, and representation that defined medieval culture. By embracing variance, scholars can gain a deeper understanding of how medieval texts were produced and consumed, and how they continue to resonate with readers today. This approach, known as dynamic reading, allows us to see the Roman de la Rose not as a fixed, unchanging work, but as a vibrant, evolving text that reflects the diverse and changing world of medieval Europe. Bernard Cerquiglini, a linguist, highlighted that the best way to understand the variations in medieval texts was by studying the actual manuscripts. He believed that manuscripts were the true repositories of these variations, and scholars needed to focus on them to explore the nuances of medieval literature. This idea was further developed in the January 1990 issue of Speculum, where a call was made for a return to manuscripts as a primary focus of study. This call was a natural extension of Cerquiglini's earlier work, but it aimed to broaden the scope beyond just literary language to include the entire manuscript as a complex and dynamic entity. In my introduction to that issue of Speculum, I described the manuscript matrix as a place of radical contingencies. This means that manuscripts are filled with elements that are not always consistent or predictable. These elements can include the timing of when different parts were added, anachronisms, and conflicting perspectives. The way these elements are presented can sometimes create a disconnect between what the viewer perceives and what the original creator intended. This disconnect can reveal deeper layers of meaning, including insights into the unconscious motivations of the scribes and artists. I also noted that the manuscript matrix is full of gaps or interstices, where interventions in the text can be seen. These interventions, whether visual or verbal, can be understood as pulsations of the unconscious, a term borrowed from Jacques Lacan. These interventions often reveal and conceal aspects of the subject, creating a split in the way the subject is represented. This is particularly evident in illuminated manuscripts, where the visual and verbal elements can create a complex and layered representation of the text. The nature of medieval manuscripts is such that they cannot be separated from their context. A text is not just a collection of words, it is a narrative that requires a material form to exist. This material form could be as ephemeral as an oral recitation, or as enduring as a written manuscript. Writing itself needs a physical medium, typically parchment or paper, but other materials like wood or stone have also been used. The mode of reproduction is crucial in understanding the concept of variance. Cerquiglini points out that variance was a fundamental aspect of medieval literary aesthetics, which is very different from the modern aesthetic of a fixed definitive text. Printing, while it reduced textual variation, did not eliminate it. Instead, it created a new kind of variance, one that was more about the dissemination of a standardized text rather than the creative variations found in medieval manuscripts. The joyous appropriation, or the creative rewriting of texts, was a key feature of medieval manuscript culture. This process was driven by scribes and artists, who saw themselves as creative collaborators with the original authors. However, studying these variations was challenging in the pre-digital era. Scholars had to examine manuscripts one at a time, often in different locations, which made comparative analysis difficult. The launch of the Digital Library of Medieval Manuscripts at Johns Hopkins University in 1995 changed this. Now, scholars can compare multiple manuscripts on the same screen, making it possible to analyze variations and understand the motivations behind them. One of the most significant differences between medieval and modern textual experiences is the concept of textuality itself. Jacqueline Cerquiglini-Toulet asks fundamental questions about what a text is in the context of medieval manuscript culture. She points out that the boundaries of a text in a manuscript are not always clear. Incipit's beginnings and explicit's endings might be missing, and readers must rely on internal markers to identify the text. This fluidity of textual borders means that the medieval text is never closed. It is always open to interpretation and variation. The layout of a manuscript folio is very different from that of a printed page. In a manuscript, the text shares space with other elements, such as images, decorations, and annotations. These elements are not separate but are intricately interwoven, creating a visual and textual choreography. This choreography is evident in the manuscript of Christine de Pisan's Scent Ballads, where the author is depicted in her study, surrounded by decorative motifs that blend text and image. The folio is a complex graphic space that requires active cognitive engagement from the reader to navigate and understand. The making of a codex involves two key factors that make each manuscript unique: the scribble hand and the painted images. Each scribe has a distinctive style, which can help identify the historical and intellectual context of the manuscript. The images, whether miniatures, initials, or decorative elements, also contain crucial information. The reader must constantly compare the text and images to understand how they interact and contribute to the overall narrative. This interaction creates a parallax effect, where the same scene can be perceived from different angles, leading to variations in manuscript illustration over time. The dynamic nature of medieval manuscripts is not just a result of external factors, but is also inherent in the manuscript itself. The material of parchment prepared from animal hides has a pluripotential capacity, much like pluripotent cells. This capacity allows manuscripts to develop in multiple directions, leading to the production of varied versions of the same work. This pluripotentiality is driven by a concept called energeia, which was central to medieval rhetorical theory. Energeia is the active force that transforms what it transmits, enabling beings and objects to achieve their purpose. For Aristotle, energeia is the key to actualizing the potential of an object, moving it towards its authentic end or telos. In the context of medieval manuscripts, energeia explains the continuous production of new versions and the varied programs of illumination. It is the force that keeps the text open and dynamic, allowing it to renew itself over time. The scribes and illuminators who created these manuscripts were not just copying texts, but were actively engaging with them, adding their own interpretations and innovations. This process of differential repetition is what makes each manuscript a unique and valuable source for understanding medieval literature and culture. Aristotle's concept of energeia, the active realization of potential, profoundly influences our understanding of medieval manuscripts, particularly works like the Roman de la Rose. For Aristotle, energeia is not a linear process, but a continuous and open-ended one. It is the constant striving to perfect the eidos, or form, of a being or object, but this perfection is never fully realized. Instead, energeia is an ongoing process of self-variation and self-actualization. When applied to medieval manuscripts, energeia suggests that each version of a work is not a mere copy of an original, but a distinct and valid actualization of the work's eidos. This idea challenges the traditional view that earlier versions are more authoritative and authentic. According to Aristotle, the form or eidos of a work is atemporal and exists independently of time. Thus, all versions, regardless of when they were created, are equally valid efforts to realize the form. In the Roman de la Rose, this concept is particularly evident in the manuscript's illuminations. Illuminations are not just decorative, but are integral to the work's energeia. They engage the reader's senses and intellect, provoking reflection and correlation with the text. For example, in the manuscript held at the Bibliothèque Sainte Geneviève, MS 1126, the bifolio layout on folios 7v and 8r showcases the personifications of Riches, Largus, and Junus. On folio 7v, two miniatures depict Riches and Largus with their respective friends, engaged in polite and reserved conversation. The rubrics identify them as Riches and her friend, and Largus and her friend. These images represent the opulence and generosity of court culture, where interactions are decorous and controlled. However, on the facing folio 8r, the miniature of Junus presents a stark contrast. Junus, personified as a young couple, is shown in an exuberant embrace, their passion unbridled and public. The rubric simply identifies this as Junus, omitting any mention of the female companion, which aligns with the poet's description of Junus as naive and carefree. The contrast between the restrained interactions on folio 7v and the passionate embrace on folio 8r is deliberate. It highlights the tension between the court's social norms and the unbridled desires of youth. This juxtaposition is significant because it sets the stage for the protagonist's own encounter with desire. Just as Junus's behavior disrupts the social harmony of the court, the protagonist's encounter with the rose will challenge his understanding of love and courtly conduct. The god of love will later teach the protagonist that his desires must be governed, unlike the uninhibited passion of Junus. Jean de Meun, the continuator of the Roman de la Rose, offers a different perspective. He suggests that the poem's claims about the nature of love are more complex and less transparent than Guillaume Dolores implies. For Jean, the portrayal of Junus's uncontrolled desire reveals the underlying truths about human passion, which are often hidden behind the formalities of courtly love. Thus, the Roman de la Rose and its various manuscript versions demonstrate the dynamic and pluripotent nature of energeia. Each version, with its unique illuminations and textual variations, is a distinct actualization of the work's form. This view emphasizes the manuscript's role as a living, evolving text, continually redefining itself through the process of energeia. The complexities, contradictions, and conflicts in the Roman de la Rose are a result of the dynamic interplay between different versions and the manuscript's evolution, as well as the author's intentional craftsmanship. A particularly intriguing example of this is found on folio 7v of the Geneviève bifolio, where a detailed description of precious objects, meant to showcase the fabulous wealth of Riches, is followed by a unique rubric that reveals the name of Riches's lover, Variance Truth. The text describes Riches holding the hand of a page boy of great beauty, and the rubric Variance esti alami Riches, Truth is the name of Riches's lover, appears just above the line Qui fu sies amis veritix, who was her true friend lover. This rubric is not found in other manuscripts, making it a unique addition that enhances the text's meaning. The red color and position of the rubric outside the narrative make it stand out, functioning as both a visual marker and a critical commentary. This interaction between the rubric and the poetic text is rare and clever, creating a dual reading that is both witty and critical. It highlights the variant readings found in different manuscripts, such as Qui fu san ami veritux, who was her true friend lover, and Se san ami veritas, it is her friend lover truth. The Roman de la Rose is one of the most visually rich texts of the medieval period, where the poetic narrative and the illuminations work together to create a multi-layered experience. The codex format, with its combination of poetic text, painting, rubrics, and decoration, allows for a multi-representational format that imprints a cognitive image on the reader's mind. This process of reading and viewing makes the parchment leaf a reflection of the reader's imagination, blending the visual and textual elements into a cohesive whole. One of the most evocative examples of this is a miniature from a Roman de la Rose manuscript in the municipal library in Lyon, which depicts the god of love shooting an arrow through the lover's eye to lodge in his heart. This image illustrates the passage where the god of love, who has been stalking the lover, draws his bow and shoots an arrow that penetrates the lover's eye and reaches his heart. The scene is a metaphor for how the sight of a potential love object can ignite passion in the heart. The image, by stripping away the natural setting and focusing on the aggression, captures the essence of the narrative and the lover's internal transformation. The Roman de la Rose also draws on classical mythology, particularly the story of Actaeon from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Actaeon, transformed from hunter to hunted, experiences a physical metamorphosis that leaves his mind unchanged. In contrast, the lover in the Rose undergoes a psychological transformation that is more profound and enduring. The arrows of love not only penetrate the lover's heart, but also infect his entire cognitive system, leading to a lasting torment. A miscellany in the Bibliothèque Municipale in Dijon, which includes the Roman de la Rose, followed by several satiric and moral poems, demonstrates how energeia, the principle of creative energy, attracts and organizes affinity works into a single space. Despite the significant defacement of this manuscript, with many miniatures removed, the gaps left behind still speak to us. These empty spaces force us to reflect on the role of images in reading and understanding the text. The absence of the miniatures, which were meant to illustrate the ekphrastic figures of courtly vices, highlights the interdependence of text and image and the loss of meaning that occurs when one is removed. In the end, the Roman de la Rose and its manuscripts demonstrate the rich interplay between text, image, and the creative process. Each element contributes to a deeper understanding of the work, even in the face of damage and loss. The dynamic nature of the manuscript tradition and the creative energy that drives it ensure that the Rose continues to resonate and inspire, just as it has for centuries.